This is the second year in row, the second year we're doing this. I have the honor of introducing Rav Schwartz. And I'm going to be very brief. Rav Schwartz is the based in of both the CRC and the RCA, and has been, as Dr. Skolnick said, a pioneer on these issues. And without further ado, Rav Schwartz.
Thank you, Doron. Worthy Rabbonim in the audience, ladies and gentlemen, Meirei v'Rabosai. The title of my talk that is mentioned here is The Insights to Rabbinic Interpretation. Now let's get the record clear. When using that title, I think I originally gave a different title, but whatever it is, I'm going to give an interpretation to that title. And the interpretation is the following. I'm not going to give an academic lecture on insights of rabbinic interpretation, which could fill volumes and is a subject of many rabbinic works and controversies, how we do that, what's the methodology, when is it applied, and so forth and so on. I'm going to give just two insights to two, I would say, laws or areas of law in halacha, which is the basic of Jewish law, from the oral law all the way down to the codes of the Shulchan Aruch, which are used today, that impact on this particular title of this whole conference. If you know something, say something. The question of knowing something and saying something, where we do know that in Jewish law and conduct, as has come down to us, speech, the use of language, how you deal with it, and speaking about other people is a very great responsibility. And I don't have to go into at length again that there's this classic sefer which became so famous that the author was always known by the name of the sefer, of the book. Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen of Radin of blessed memory, known as a saint and sage of the Jewish people, who lived approximately almost a century, from the late 1830s to 1933, when he passed away, wrote this sefer in the last part of the 19th century. Chofetz Chaim means the will of somebody who wants to live, taken from a verse in Tehillim, which we say in the morning prayers, in the morning davening on Shabbos. It's in that particular verse of 34, Lamed Daled, Mihu Isha Chofetz Chaim, who wants to have life, is the main thing is, Ohev Yomim, he loves days, Netzor Lashoncho Mirah. Guard your tongue from evil. How do you guard your tongue? How do you control your tongue? How are you to address other people, speak about other people? In what context may you say certain things about other people which might be derogatory, demeaning, although they are true? Lashon hara, the evil tongue does not mean saying a false statement. It's the truth. We know that somebody is a rascal or so forth. When can you talk about that rascal to other people? When is it allowed? When is it permissible? Or you know somebody has done certain things. Now, why I'm speaking about this, and this is not the place to talk about all of the Lashonis of Lashon Hara, because I might be guilty myself in this public podium of doing that. You never know where the power of speech is. But what I've come against in I would say, in rabbinic practice, when it comes to matters dealing with the question of abuse or so forth, you start probing. Someone tells you something, and people say, oh, I can't talk about that. That's Lashon Hara. That'll be a use of the evil tongue. I can't even speak about it. And yet, sometimes there is a situation where, well, what do? Do you report it? Do you say something about it? You know, there are people in certain communities, and I've been in some of those communities, where you couldn't even talk about such a thing because, oh, that's Lashon Hara. Or in general terms, it's just gossip. It's tale-bearing or so forth. But when it comes to something that if you know, using the title, if you know something, if you know that a certain individual is abusing a child or so forth, and it's reasonable to understand that that's happening. It's not just some mere rumor, because rumors, accepting rumors that are just set off by people that are irresponsible, that's a prohibition. You shouldn't listen to all what we call hearsay. But if you have reasonable, call it a very reasonable doubt about somebody is abusing somebody, abusing a child especially, and it could be that it's beating the child. That's not just sexual abuse, over beating the child. And we'll talk about a certain tshuva, response, responsum, written by illustrious Rav in Eretz Yisrael about such a situation. That's also abuse. If you know about it, you have to report it. You have an obligation to do that. Now, years ago, I wrote an article in a magazine called 10. 10 is an abbreviation, Torah Educational Network, which is published by the Educators Council of America, which has its support and direction from Yeshiva University. So I was asked to write an article about abuse as far as from an educational standpoint. Let's say you have a teacher in a school. Child comes in and comes in with a black eye, looks injured, looks depressed, and the teacher becomes aware that this child is abused. What is he supposed to do? How should he react about that? So with that, I go, it's not just a question of saying something bad about parents or about the people surrounding that child or so forth, but it's a question, how do you report it and how do you respond? So the second aspect of what I've included in my interpretation is here, something which is the major consideration generally in the general Orthodox community. Talking about all streams, I'm not going into particulars. I'm not talking about a place, whether it's in Williamsburg, Borough Park, it could be Teaneck, it could be the 5 towns, Flatbush, all these places, Muncie, or wherever there are different very densely populated areas of Jews that are very observant of all aspects of Torah, day schools, and so forth. What is the teacher supposed to do? Should he report it to the principal? And not only what does the principal do? Should he report it, go to the parents, report it to the authorities? So at that time, I mentioned something which is controversial in the rabbinic world, but it is a very important psak, rabbinic decision uttered by one of the great, reliable poskim, decisors from the time of the early 20th century, the Gaon Rabbi Yechiel Michal Epstein of blessed memory, who wrote a classic sefer on Jewish law on the Shulchan Aruch called the Aruch HaShulchan. And his works are looked into today by all rabbinic authorities or decisors. Some disagree, some will agree, but he has his unique way of explaining the halacha, the law, from its primary sources to its actual application. So in the section on the Code of Civil Law, and there's a law that is found in the Talmud, and this is where the problem arises greatly in our types of community. It's a concept known as mesira, informing to the government. Now, in Talmudic times, the way it's described, where Jews were, they're not talking about being in a Jewish state or so forth, they were in the diaspora, different parts of the world. Talmudic times, they mostly were in Iraq, what is today Iraq, Babylonia, that's where the Babylonian Talmud came from, or places that they were controlled by the Persians or Parthians, other places were controlled by the Romans. Later on in medieval times, going into Europe, both Eastern Europe and Western Europe, there was all the feudal society. There were all these barons and dukes and others, and many times you didn't even have a central government of law. You had a tyrannical situation of an individual who had power. He had his own men-at-arms, his mercenaries, and he squeezed taxes out of everybody. And of course, That's the way he did it with the Jews. So at that time, the Jews were always in danger. If they want to know where someone's money is, where his goods, if you informed to them, that was considered a very strong and stringent prohibition to Mesira. Mesira means giving over to literally to a government. So there are prohibitions about that. In fact, there were cases even in Eastern Europe, closer to modern times, which I've read in the contemporary Yiddish literature of that time, how a Moser in a town, in a shtetl, the Jews did away with him because he informed the government about certain things that cost them not only, it wasn't a question of illegal jail terms, but the confiscation of goods, of money, and exile, you name it. So they did away with him. It was not considered a prohibition to get rid of him, take him out, as we would say. So the Aruch HaShulchan says the law, and this is a striking statement, it's clearly there in Siman Shin Peches 388, there in that section of the Aruch HaShulchan, where he says the governments, he refers to Malchus Britannia. Remember, he was in Tsarist Russia, early 20th century. But he says in a government like the government of Great Britain, which is a government of laws, has a concept of democracy, he said, in such a place there's no prohibition of Mesira. There's no law prohibiting, informing, or telling the government that someone is committing a crime. This is the point. A very stirring type of thing. He even includes then Tsarist Russia, because at least the Tsarist Russia was officially a government of laws. How does it make a difference? He talk about the wild countries, he says the governments that were there loosely in Africa or other places where there were warlords and so forth. There was not what we would call today in the democratic country of the United States with a constitutional guarantee of due process. Due process, the law protects people even when they are accused, alleged to be somebody. You can't convict a person in the newspapers or just by accusing him. You can't hold a person certain times. So I'm just mentioning these things. So he's on record. And this is a very controversial thing because others have said, well, we disagree with that. Mesira is at all times, no matter what kind of a government is. So if that's the case, someone knows about child abuse, if you follow the other approach, don't report it to the government, because what will happen, the abuser will be arrested, he put in jail by the non-Jewish guy, and the Yiddish thinking was in Eastern Europe, and we could understand it. It was them and us. But I always tell people in the United States government is not them, it's us. We are the people that put the elected officials. They're supposed to listen to us. We have our rights. It's nicht sie, but uns. We are. And therefore, I'm elaborating in that. I hold very strongly of the Aruch HaShulchan's position. If someone knows definitely, quite clearly, just can't make a rumor. You know, he can take revenge. And I know from my sitting on the bezin in matrimonial Jewish law, there's some cases where there's an argument between the spouses that comes to a divorce. Sometimes the wife or the husband will accuse the other one of abusing a child. It never was known before, but they bring that up. So that's without any reasonable source or out. It's just in order to make be a spiteful statement. But we're talking about a serious situation in the community. Someone knows a neighbor there is abusing a child and knows something to that effect. Well, that person should be reported to the authorities. If someone would ask me today, in fact, I told someone today who was talking about a burglary. I said, did you hesitate calling the police? And we happen to know that the thief was a Jew, a Yiddish Ganov. There are such people, you know. It doesn't have to be a Madoff with billions. It could be less money. There are all sorts of people that do it. Do you hesitate calling the police? Do you have to call up the rabbi to ask a shaila, should I call him? No, you don't. If you know that there's someone, no matter what it is, he's a predator, he's an abuser, whether he's beating a child, whether he's abusing it in a sexual manner or so forth, we have to be forthright and immediately stop that person. That's the way I interpret that aspect of the Jewish law. Now, let me mention to you that responsum because it's important, because he was a world-famous decisor. The late Gaon, great rabbinic personality in Israel, of Yehuda Waldenberg, Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg, who passed away, unfortunately, about 2 years ago, who wrote 21 volumes of responsa besides other works. And he's quoted all over the place by all modern decisors, no matter who they are, right or left wing, centrist, so forth. So he has there a tshuva, a responsa. Here were the questions. And with this, I would sort of conclude the winding up this aspect of the interpretation of movement forward in this direction. A physician is in a hospital, and they bring in a child who seems to be battered. And the doctor looks at the child, sees all wounded, he doesn't know why, but he's very suspicious that this child was beaten by the parents, abused. So what is this shaila? The one that's asking the shaila is himself a famous doctor who's wrote rabbinic works, Dr. Abraham, who wrote the Nishmas Avram. So the doctor faces the following dilemma. He knows that if as soon as he reports it to the government, they'll take the child away from the parents. You can't allow such a child to be with the parents. They might put him in a foster home where he won't get kashrus, he won't get Shabbos, he won't get this and that. Should he report him or not? So Rav Waldenberg says, absolutely you report. You can't be worried about that. You have to save this child's life. Child is being beaten, abused. He'll have a warped sense of being a human being if he reaches the age of being a teenager or grows up. So that's one case. And in the same tshuva, he has an even worse shaila. There, someone knows that a father is having incestuous relationships with his little daughter, abusing a daughter. This is not an unknown thing in sexual predatory practice of incestuous things, which many times when you have children study in the day school about the illicit relationships, it's far away, far off, who knows it happens. But unfortunately, it is happening. It happens all over by all types of gender and all types of religious or irreligious backgrounds. So is asked, what about that? There, is the child in danger of losing its life or not? So Rav Waldenberg says clearly, you must report that to the government. No matter what the government is, you must report that. If you know something, say something. That's qualified in Jewish law. So that, my dear ladies and gentlemen, is just a brief interpretation of these two matters. When it comes to Lashon Hara, if you know that this allegation is true or so forth, don't be afraid to pass it on to the proper places. You won't be guilty of Lashon Hara, just like you're trying to tell somebody that if you go to this particular place, you're liable to have, there's a dangerous place, there's an accident can take place. That's not Lashon Hara because someone is not a good driver. Someone doesn't know how to drive. You would stop that. It's not Lashon Hara. Here you're talking about abuse of children, especially to people who are victimized, who will suffer their whole lives if it's not stopped. It must be reported. It's not Lashon Hara, and it's not Mesira. Hashem should help us all, the Almighty should help us all, that we should get a balance in our lives, that these things should not occur in our Jewish community. Thank you.